Hey guys, it's Graham. What's cracking? I do not have a brand new book to review and offer to you today. I was not able to listen to one. That was the plan, and it turns out that plan will get derailed for the next 2 days because I have a trainee in the cab with me for the next little while, which is fine because that means that my routes go a lot faster. And I am currently headed to work, headed to the gym. No, I decided to take the gym off for today, do it tomorrow. I am going to be home before 10 a.m. today, which is nice. Like I'm taking the early out, spending some time with the kids, and maybe even get to read a little bit in the shop before I go to sleep. If you've seen the community posts, you know that I'm reading the Silmarillion in paperback, and I'm through the earliest chapters where it's a lot of like this person begat this person, and this happened, and these gods bickered, and blah blah blah. Now I'm into the saga of Feanor, where things start to get a little bit more linear, and it reads a little bit more like a traditional epic fantasy. And I'm just really falling into this book and having a great time reading it, which is not historically been my experience with it. It's been challenging to read it in the past, and I haven't always finished it in one go, but I'm enjoying it this time. I even got a few minutes on Saturday to go out into the shop with my boys, and they took books that they were reading, and we read a chapter of our own stuff, and then kind of shared and just chatted about it. And I was like, this is really the kind of stuff that I dreamed about even before I had kids. Like finding a quiet time to just consume a book and not really do anything else, and share it with other people, which is a microcosm of what I do here. So I have a question for you guys. There are books that work really, really well, depending on what time of year it is. Obviously, I try to read some patriotic or historical stuff, or rah-rah jingoistic America stuff in July, and there's the Christmas stuff in November, and the spooky stuff, the horror stuff or whatever that I read in October. September is a transition month. Summer is winding down, autumn is around the corner. What do you guys read at this time of year? It seems like, for me anyway, something Tolkien or Tolkien-esque is a reliable go-to, and the man wrote so much, and I have read such a small percentage of it, that I can reliably just pick up a Tolkien book every September and read that as I'm expecting the cooler and calmer months to transition in. But what do you guys read? What do you recommend? And as a follow-up question to that, what book do you really wish that you could read again for the first time? One book that I'm going to hype up every fall, like I'm sure it's going to get a mention every time this time of year comes around, is Brian's Winter by Gary Paulson. Just because it's such a short, tiny little thing, and the first time I read it, it completely took over my attention. And I was able to just get lost in this story about a kid surviving the wilderness. And I think there's more to it than just the survival aspect of it, which makes for an exciting read. But he got to a part where he was secure in it. So much of the early part of Hatchet was like him just like literally trying to survive one day to the next and one moment to the next as something new and unknown popped up, and he had to adapt to it and learn from it before it hurt him or killed him. He realized just how frail and fragile he was. But the story of Brian's Winter is really about the finalization of that change, of him realizing that he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving in the woods, that he belonged in the woods, and that while he still had a lot to learn, he had a commanding grasp on the basics of his survival. He had food, he had shelter, he had warmth, and he realized that once he got to the point where he had spare time, that he was even starting to go, as Paulson says, stir crazy and looking for things to do. That kind of takes me back to a world history class that I had in 10th grade, where the teacher explained that once people started to develop farming and then farming techniques, so much so to the point where they started to have spare time and they could think and dream, that was when civilization really started to make its change into like the technological era. Um, Once you're able to secure spare time for yourself, uh, you really start to become a different person. That's an underappreciated aspect of that book, I think. Like there's a bit of adventurism to it. It's short. It's easy to dip in and out of it. And there's all the stuff that you learn, but that character change in Brian, where he stops being a city boy who's just clawing his way from one moment to the next in the woods to becoming like a true occupant of the wilderness who moves like in sync with it and in time with it. That's an inspiring transition to watch. There's a similar book to it. I don't think I've touched on it on this channel, but I've always been like a huge fan of Hatchet and the other books in that series, and I was sharing those with my wife because, like any American school child, she had read Hatchet in the 90s, but she hadn't read a whole bunch of the sequels. So we talked about those early on in our marriage, and she told me about this similar series, which for the life of me, I can't remember the name of the author, but it's called The Other Side of the Mountain or My Side of the Mountain. There are a couple of books in the series, and like the first one has one title and the second has the other. This is set in the 1950s, and it's about a kid who willingly goes up into the Catskill Mountains in New York because he knows a couple of things, and city life is hard for his family. They got too many kids and they're crammed into an apartment. And he's like, well, I know a couple of things and I've got a library card so I can figure out the rest. And he goes in and deliberately tries to live in the woods. And he's got to deal with things like the change of seasons and all of that. Brian's Winter is an alternate ending to Hatchet where, even though he survives the summer, most of the things that he learned become useless to him in the winter and he has to learn all over again. There's a humbling quality to that. These books, the Other Side of the Mountain books, it's less about a kid being forcibly humbled and more about his curiosity being rewarded. And I like that as well, just because I'm naturally a curious person, but there are times when I kind of tamp that down just because I think, well, if I get curious about this, where's it going to lead? Or this is something I definitely don't want to be curious about. And other times when like you set out to learn something and then you learn it and you're like, oh, that was kind of disappointing. So I don't worry about that so much, but I like having that curiosity and that effort rewarded, and that was, I think, an underlying aspect of that particular story. And when you find a book like that satisfies something in you that you weren't looking for, or didn't know that you were looking for, I find that just a wonderful thing. And in a way, that's what I'm looking for every time I pick up a book that I don't know much about or that I haven't read before. Think back earlier this year, just this summer, to when I was reading Junkyard Joe. Like, I expected to find an otherwise enjoyable book about a soldier robot who then became something slightly more than that for whatever reason. I did not expect it to strike so many relevant chords with me, but it was incredible. It did its job perfectly. The same can be said of Geiger, a book who conceptually I was resistant to, but it ended up having all these things in it that were much more my speed and much more satisfying to me. I like it when friends recommend books that end up really living up to the hype. I will admit that that's not so often the case, but I think I've kind of conditioned myself as an amateur book reviewer to try to find good things in books. And for the most part, books have some good thing about them. You can read it and say, okay, this wasn't for me. This was targeted at another audience, and here's what was good about it. Here's what was well done about it. It's very rare that I'll read a book and absolutely hate it, and extremely rare that I will hate it to such an extent that I'll name it and excoriate it here. And for the most part, I'm out looking for the good, and each book can have something good about it. But it's that rare quality of finding something that fits perfectly for a situation, or finding something that perfectly fills a gap in my personal library that I didn't know that I was looking for. So I'm putting this one out to the hive mind. This time of year, the ending of summer, the beginning of fall, before we get into the pumpkins and spiders and ghosts of it all, what's a really, really good September book? What would you guys recommend? Think about it. Let me know in the comments below. Till next time, drive safe. See you out there.